And I'll be taking the floor now to talk about joint work with Professor Nelson Tebby from Cornell Law School and Dr. Yoav Kantor, a very recent graduate of Hebrew University Center for Interdisciplinary Data Science. And the type of question that we're trying to answer in this project really involves a long debate that we see in many places around the world, specifically in the United States, also in Europe, also in Israel, between religious freedom on the one hand and gender and sexual orientation equality on the other hand. So in recent years, we see conflicts involving these two rights and social camps more generally becoming the hotspots of the culture wars in the United States, penetrating healthcare markets, employment markets, and the general marketplace, including famously with respect to the wedding sector. Now, the legal and social question that keeps arising in all of these scenes is who should prevail, right? Is it the liberty rights of religious objectors or the equality rights of women and sexual minorities? And this recently has become a particularly acute and sensitive question in the area of child welfare. So just as a brief background, in virtually all states in the United States, governments place children in foster homes and adoptive homes with the help of private agencies. So not only government enterprise, but also private agencies. Many of these agencies are religious. Oftentimes, these are the key players, often have been placing children with families even before the government, the American government, decided its business to do that. And some of these agencies, not all of them, but some of these agencies, again, often key players, would not place children within same-sex households, only with opposite-sex households. And today, these agencies run into conflict in states in the United States that legislated and enacted anti-discrimination laws, specifically prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in the placement of children in homes. So again, the question is who should prevail? This has been in the Supreme Court last summer, and there is continuous litigation in many instances in the United States, and it's still an open question. And I want to first acknowledge that this is a really complex and multifaceted question. The answer for it depends, at least in part, on the social consequences of deciding either way. And what we argue is that we particularly should care about the consequences for children. This is because children are the specific goal of the child welfare system. It is children that we want to protect. It is the children's life prospects that we want to promote. And so it is children that we should particularly care, not the adults fighting over who should win, but the children that we want to protect in this system and find good homes and save them from lives of misery. Now, the problem is that we have dueling claims about the effects of anti-discrimination laws on children. And we saw that in litigation, and we see that in legislators, and we see that all the way till today. And how does it go? So the religious opponents of anti-discrimination laws are arguing that anti-discrimination laws are crowding out religious players. So private religious agencies would not serve same-sex couples, and they would prefer to close shop, to close their businesses, and leave the foster care and adoption market rather than having to serve same-sex couples. If that's going to happen, then children will have less options and maybe even less good options. Why less good options? There's some surveys from the 90s showing that foster parents recruited by religious organizations retained longer in the system, and so they were able to provide care for more children over time. And if that's the case, then clearly children are going to be harmed if we enforce anti-discrimination law. The other camp in these disputes, in litigation and in social battles, is arguing exactly the opposite. So first, LGBTQ and equality proponents are saying that actually many religious pleasures do not crowd out. So if the fraction of agencies that prefer to close shop is really small, then there's no reason to assume that this would have a large effect on children. And also, anti-discrimination laws are also crowding in new players. These are same-sex couples that are now able to provide loving homes to children. And if that's the case, then children will actually have more options and maybe even better options, this time pointing to surveys that are more recent showing that same-sex households in the United States are more likely to foster and adopt children than opposite-sex couples. And also they're more likely to take more vulnerable children. For example, older children, children with disabilities and mental difficulties. And if that's the case, then children are supposed to benefit from the enactment of anti-discrimination law. The problem is, unfortunately, it's endemic and prevalent in legal argument, is that these are all empirical claims without evidence. So that's what we saw in litigation. In the past summer, both parties argued that winning or losing is going to affect children the way they think that this should affect children. But all of the evidence that they brought was anecdotal pieces, stories, one data point from one state, and nothing substantial that the court could really rely on this very acute and important social question. So what we're trying to do in this project is really answer this question. How then do anti-discrimination laws influence child welfare? To do that, we first build a data set of all of the legal changes that occurred in the United States over the past 20 years. So from 2000 till today. And what you can see here, and I'll go through this briefly, is that, I hope it's okay, is that at the beginning of 2000, there were very few states with these specific anti-discrimination laws. So oftentimes those states were already protecting from, for example, racial discrimination. But very few states at the beginning of 2000 had protections from sexual orientation discrimination for specifically foster and adoptive parents. And then that gradually changes over the past 20 years, where the final count is that 31 to 32 states, depending on whether we're looking at foster care or adoption, because there are very few states that distinguish between the two, have anti-discrimination laws. And there are 8 states that enacted religious exemption laws. This is important. So these are states that have laws that specifically grant religious agencies the ability to discriminate if they want against same-sex parents or in general. And you can see that some of these states enacted religious exemption laws even without available anti-discrimination laws. So essentially against a vacuum of anti-discrimination laws. And there are 9 states that did not enact at all, and only 3 states with both sets of laws. And one might ask, why to enact a religious exemption law without an anti-discrimination law? Some of these laws are preemptive, so you may want to preempt a potential future federal law. Some of them are geared towards more progressive areas inside those states that sometimes had policies or thought to enact policies that will protect same-sex households. And the first limitations I already want to acknowledge in this project is that we cannot measure the effect of religious exemption laws in this project because they were enacted very late into the 2010s, they only apply to 2 to 3% of our data. And so this is something that we would like to save for future work. So everything I'm going to tell you today about the effect of anti-discrimination laws, you should interpret as the effect of anti-discrimination laws in the absence of religious exemption, which is actually the legal question that at least many of the people involved in this litigation are interested in. So what's the data that we have. So very interestingly and importantly, the US federal government obliges all states from the beginning of 2000 to report on each and every child who enters and exits the foster care system. That's conditional on federal support of their child welfare system. And we have federal data on about 6 million children who entered and exited foster care in the United States over these 20 years, which is a huge number of children, if you think about it, which is very sad. And our focus for all children, I don't know if anyone have seen The Queen's Gambit and have some empathy for Beth Harmon. For all children, we're looking to see first their outcomes while they're in the foster care system. Did they find themselves in congregate care? That's considered the less good option. So are they in a home like Beth with like lots of children getting drugs to keep them in function? Or do they find foster homes, which is considered the better alternative? And for the 1 million about adoption candidates, we're looking to see whether they found, these are children that the system is looking actively to find an adoptive home for. It's not looking to find an adoptive home for all children, because some children are only taken from home temporarily because a parent is sick or for similar reasons. So, but for those who are adoption candidates, did they found permanent home? Or like Beth's friend Jolene, did they age out, which is considered the worst option, because aging out is from homelessness to jail. Essentially, there are strong correlations showing the people who, children who went through the foster care system and did not find a home and eventually aged out, have very gloomy life prospects. And we're looking not only at whether those like binary outcomes, home versus not home, but also how long did it take? Because how long did it take is considered to be a very important measure of the success of the system. So if a child lingers long without a home, then the trauma accumulates for longer. And these are all very common measures of social welfare scientists and social welfare practitioners for how to measure child outcomes. So I will be very brief in terms of strategy of analysis. I'm really happy to answer questions about it later, but just to show you the data, I will just say for those of you who are into empirical studies, that the obvious path to take, one would think, was to be like something like a staggered difference in difference, where we would look at similar states that enacted or not enacted and track children in those states over time. That proved very challenging in the specific case, because it turned out that states copy their neighbors' laws in fast speed. So for example, 1 to 2 years after Rhode Island would have a law, then Connecticut will also have a law. But the outcomes for children take much longer. So a child can spend 3 to 5 years on average in the system before they're able to find foster and adoptive homes. And because of these differences, it turns out that states too quickly switch between treatment and control group, and we cannot really use them as control and treatment of each other. So what we do instead is we do causal inference based on random forest techniques, which, to sort of make a long story short, rather than comparing states, we're comparing individuals. So it's like a sophisticated, significantly more sophisticated and robust matching technique. Well, as usual, matching techniques choose like several features and match individuals on these features every time. What we do is that we get all of the richness of the data. We have like 150 features, and we build a tree. We build a forest of trees that classify children based on all of their features and match children that come from anti-discrimination law regimes with children who are similar in all respects that come from non-anti-discrimination regimes. So just to give you the intuitions of that, you could think about these two children, okay, that we have data of 6 million children for foster care analysis and 1 million children for adoption analysis. And think about these children who are similar in all respects. They're both age 5, they're female, they're Black, they're removed from home from the same reason, they share the same disability, the parents are of the same age and race, only one children was administered under no anti-discrimination law and the other was administered under an anti-discrimination law. So we take these children from all countries, from all states, and compare them to each other, and we build a model that predicts for each individual child, going through their feature, whether they're black and white, non-anti-discrimination or anti-discrimination law, build for each and every individual child a prediction. So what's their home potential? Are they likely to find a home or not? And the model provides different predictions for different children. So you wouldn't be surprised to learn that the prospects of children are not all alike. And I'm going to go through the results in a second. So it's very important to look at children whose prospects are similar, and then to see for these children what happened to them if they were in an anti-discrimination or non-anti-discrimination regime. So what influences child outcomes? So the first and foremost important feature that influences child outcomes is simply the child's age. So your age when you enter the system predicts something like 80% of your prospect of finding either a foster home or an adoptive home, which you can see here. So you can see how essentially babies have an almost 100% of finding a home. And it really drops around the age of beginning 6, 7, and then it has a sharp drop in later years. There are many additional factors that contribute to the prediction. I only named a few of them here. Drug abusing parents is a huge problem that accumulated in the past 20 years. The figures are devastating. Behavioral problems, emotional distress, race, gender, by the way. So you might find it reassuring to know that girls are actually preferred as babies in these particular setting, and more. What about the impact of anti-discrimination laws? So I want to show you here very briefly the general results. And what you see here on the bottom figure, you see the effect of anti-discrimination laws on foster home placement. And here at the top, the effect of anti-discrimination laws on permanency, so for adoption candidates. And what you see here is all of the cases, so all of the data, sorted by the effect size. So what was the size of the effect of law in these cases? And what you can see essentially is that for about 80% of the cases of the children, anti-discrimination laws make no effect whatsoever, not to the better, not to the worse. You see there are almost no cases that we can see harm for these children. From most cases, the effect is zero. But there are about between 20%, maybe even 30% of the cases for which it turns out that anti-discrimination laws have a positive effect. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom in on these cases. Just before that, very briefly, the mean effects of these cases of the anti-discrimination laws. I'm going to zoom in on these cases to show you in what we call a retrospective experiment what were the real life outcomes of those 20% versus everyone else. So we're going to see figures looking at children in anti-discrimination and no anti-discrimination regimes for whom the individual predicts are going to benefit a lot or not so much from anti-discrimination laws. And because each individual gets a prediction score from the algorithm, we can actually track children that by their characteristics were supposed to benefit a lot from anti-discrimination law, but had no anti-discrimination law applicable to them, and compare them with children of the same characteristics who did have an anti-discrimination law applicable to them. Okay. So now we're looking at permanency outcomes, so adoption outcomes. And what we can see here, so those that the algorithm predicted are going to succeed are in the darker gray figures. Versus those that the algorithm predicted are not going to succeed. Sorry. Those that the anti-discrimination laws are in the dark gray figures versus no anti-discrimination laws in the gray. Here you see those that the algorithm did not predict are going to succeed so much. And we don't see significant differences, at least not in this analysis, But we see that for those who are under an anti-discrimination law, they have 10% higher chance to find an adoptive home, and they do that in less time. By the way, also those that the algorithm predict are not specifically going to benefit from finding more homes do find them in shorter time periods. And we see the same effect with respect to foster home analysis. Here, the effects are even larger. So we see them both in the group that was predicted to benefit, and it does predict a benefit more than the group that was not predicted to benefit so much. And with respect to time to placement, the effects are quite dramatic. So higher success in finding homes in less time. I won't have time to go on to all of the heterogeneous effects. So who benefits from anti-discrimination laws? I'll just leave you with this one figure that the age effects here are really interesting. So we see higher positive effect for older children who are much harder to place, as you've seen before. And we think that might be related with the fact that often children discover their sexual orientation or come out of the closet in exactly those ages that for different reasons are very hard to place. And it's a possibility that we cannot test in the data that the higher availability of same-sex household may be particularly beneficial for these children. I want to say just very briefly about robustness. We looked into specific states that enacted those laws in order to see whether we have a state effect, whether these differences are actually driven by different states. You could see that different states enacted these laws. I won't have time to go in depth into this analysis. I'll just say in briefly that we looked at states that enacted at the same period, 13 states that all enacted in the middle of the data. Hence, we could actually compare the treatment examination for these states, and we find that the results are consistent with the model. And also in terms of time, so we see that the results are consistent over time, and we have additional robustness in the paper. So going back to the question I started with, we finally have some evidence on the net effect of anti-discrimination laws. What do we see if we go back to these legal arguments that we looked at before? We see that overall we find that children benefit, so more children find home in less time. Many more vulnerable children. I didn't have time to show you all of the data, but particularly benefit. We do find two states that have mixed results. So they have New York and Maryland. They have higher placement rates, but in slightly more time. And when we're thinking about those mechanisms that were argued before, it does look as though this causal chain finds more support in our study than this causal chain. But this is a question that we're now working on in a follow-up project that also conducts in-depth interviews with social workers who worked on these conflicts.